Welcome to Talk 40 in our series on Mark's Gospel. Last time we were looking at Mark 13, 1 to 23, and considering some of the problems in interpreting this difficult chapter. I suggested that most of what Jesus says in that passage relates primarily to the events that would occur around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which Jesus so accurately predicted in verses 1 to 4. Today we're considering the rest of chapter 13, verses 24 to 37, where, as we shall see, some verses are by no means easy to understand. But let's begin by reading verses 24 to 31. Jesus is speaking. But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, men will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Before we get into the passage, let me remind you of what I said last time about difficulties interpreting the whole chapter. This will be a very brief summary, so if you haven't yet listened to or read the notes on last week's talk, I recommend that you do so before going any further. The first problem arises from the fact that Jesus is answering two questions asked by the disciples at the beginning of the chapter, and it's not always easy to decide which part of Jesus' answer refers to which question. Is this verse talking about the destruction of the temple, or does it refer to the second coming? The second difficulty is deciding which parts of Jesus' answer are to be taken literally and which are to be taken symbolically. In my view, much of the chapter is to be understood literally, but some verses must be intended to be understood symbolically or metaphorically. In attempting to resolve these difficulties, I said that the first thing we must do is to find out more about the context, and I gave a brief description of what we know from history about the horrendous events that occurred surrounding the time of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So now in today's talk, I want to do three things. 1. Examine two very different interpretations of verses 24 to 31. 2. Emphasize why it's a mistake to be constantly looking for signs of the Lord's return. And finally, summarize what lessons we have learnt from the chapter as a whole. First then, two very different interpretations of verses 24 to 31. Interpretations of these verses fall into two main categories. Those who see most or all of this passage as referring to the second coming, and those who understand most or all of the passage to refer to the events around AD 70. Clearly, these are two very different points of view, and we won't have time to deal with them in great detail. So what I'm going to do is to summarize four main arguments that seem to support the view that this passage relates to the second coming, and alongside them, to state a counter-argument that is sometimes made by those who take the alternative view. It's not my intention to be dogmatic, and in fact, part of my purpose is to encourage you to form your own conclusions, but not to be too dogmatic, whatever your view may be. First argument then. In Matthew's account, one of the questions the disciples asked Jesus was about the second coming, Matthew 24 verse 3. We would therefore expect that at least part of Jesus' answer would relate to the second coming. However, one problem with this argument is that in verse 30, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So these verses, it is argued, cannot refer to the second coming unless Jesus himself mistakenly believed that the second coming would take place within a generation of his making the statement, which it clearly did not. But the fall of Jerusalem certainly did. Second argument. The events described in verses 24 to 25 would appear to be unique in world history. They're the kind of things one might expect at the end of the age. And verse 27 talks of the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. However, in Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14, we read this. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, that is God, and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So, it's argued, in its original context, the Son of Man is coming to God and could well refer to Jesus' ascension into heaven rather than his coming from heaven. Moreover, it's difficult to see how Jesus could have intended us to understand phrases like the stars will fall from the sky, verse 25, literally. The terminology used in these verses is reminiscent of the poetic language used by the Old Testament prophets and should be interpreted symbolically. And in light of the fact that they were to be fulfilled within a generation, this, it is argued, is the best way to interpret them. Third argument. If the fig tree mentioned in verse 28 refers to Israel, as it appears to in Mark 11 verses 20 to 25, then the passage must relate to the end times when, according to this view, the full number of Gentiles has come in and all Israel shall be saved. Romans 11, 25 to 26. And compare Luke 21 verse 24. You may remember we discussed that at some length in an earlier talk. However, there's no need to assume that the mention of the fig tree refers to Israel on this occasion. Jesus could equally well have meant that just as you know that when the leaves of a fig tree start to come out, the summer is near, so be absolutely sure that when you see the things I've been talking about begin to happen, the dreadful events that will take place at the destruction of Jerusalem will soon come to pass. Fourth argument. In verse 31, Jesus says that heaven and earth will pass away, which suggests that the passage relates to the time of the end. However, the point that Jesus is making in this verse is that whatever happens, his words will never fail. There is a clear claim to deity here. Who else but God could make such a claim? Jesus is the truth, John 14:6. You can rely on everything he says, whether it be about the second coming or the destruction of Jerusalem or anything else for that matter. So, that concludes my summary of two very different interpretations of verses 24 to 31. And in my view, it would be unwise to take a dogmatic position on either side. By all means have an opinion, but don't be dogmatic about it. There are some passages of Scripture that are open to more than one possible interpretation. However, when we come to verses 32 to 37, it seems obvious to me at least that these verses must relate to the second coming, as a comparison with the parallel passage in Matthew 24, 36 to 44 clearly indicates, as we shall see. So now then, verses 32 to 37, which I've headed, "Only the Father knows the timing, so don't look for signs, but be ready." Let's read the verses. "No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with his assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight, or when the cock crows, or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch." As I've already said, the parallel passage in Matthew 24 makes it clear that it relates to the second coming. Jesus says, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." Matthew 24, verses 37 to 39. So in my view, this cannot possibly refer to the coming of the Son of Man described in Daniel 7, which we mentioned earlier, which, as we have seen, may well be better understood to be a reference to Jesus' ascension into heaven rather than his return from it. Jesus is clearly referring to his second coming, which will be as unexpected as the flood was in the time of Noah. However, unlike Noah, who was told on what day God would send the rain, no one will know the timing of the Lord's return. Jesus said that even he didn't know. And if Jesus didn't know, I wonder why some Christians seem to think that they can work it out. But it's sometimes said in response to this criticism that it was only the day and the hour that we cannot know. But in the next verses, Jesus says, "You do not know when that time will come." The Greek word for time here is kairos, which does not refer to the time of day, but means season. This is backed up by what Jesus reiterated in Acts 1:7, when he told his disciples, "It's not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has put under his own authority." So why does Jesus tell us to be alert, be on guard, watch? The answer is simple. He doesn't mean watch for signs. He means stay awake. Be alert in verse 23 literally means don't go to sleep. It's used of the disciples in Gethsemane, whom Jesus found sleeping. And here in verse 36, Jesus says, "If he, the Son of Man, comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping." And the word for watch in verses 34, 35 and 37 means keep awake, be vigilant. It's used elsewhere in the New Testament in connection with not letting the enemy break through, Luke 12:39, standing firm in the faith and being strong, 1 Corinthians 16:13, keeping awake in prayer, Colossians 4:2, being sober and vigilant because the enemy goes about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour, 1 Peter 5:8, and staying awake and not being found naked and shamefully exposed when the Lord returns. Revelation 16 and verse 15. So, when the Lord tells us to watch, he's not telling us to watch for signs. He's saying that because we do not know when he will return, we need to be in a permanent state of readiness. We can do that without constantly looking for signs. We can do it by living lives that please him and by using the gifts and talents he has given us. We should concentrate on telling others about him, not trying to know what Jesus has told us is not for us to know. Acts 1, 6-8. So let's finish by looking at lessons that we can learn from the whole chapter. I've pointed out that the problems of interpretation arise from two factors. One, deciding which of the disciples' two questions in verse 4 Jesus is answering at any point in the chapter. And two, determining when the language he is using is meant to be understood literally or symbolically. Because of these difficulties, I have suggested that it would be unwise to be dogmatic, but that perhaps verses 5 to 23 should be seen as largely relating to Jesus' prophecy of destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, that verses 24 to 31 are open to either interpretation, depending mainly on whether one sees verses 24 to 27 as literal or symbolic, and that verses 32 to 37 relate very definitely to the second coming. However, despite the difficulties, I do believe that the principles that Jesus teaches in all three sections are relevant to all Christians throughout the history of the church. And so I want to conclude by reminding you of 7 things that I've already mentioned, either in the last talk or in this. I hope that, whatever your view on the second coming, you will find yourself in agreement. Well, at least with most of them. 1. We must watch out for deceivers. 2. We must not be surprised by international turmoil and natural disasters. 3. We must expect to be persecuted. 4. We must continue to tell others about Jesus, relying on the help of the Holy Spirit. 5. We must not try to work out the timing of Christ's coming, because it's not for us to know. 6. We must stay awake in a permanent state of readiness for the Lord's return, because, 7, the Lord is certainly coming. And if we're ready, we simply do not need to know when. So, my prayer is that you and I will be ready whenever the Lord may return. Finally, as I mentioned last time, we'll be taking a break for the rest of August, and our series on Mark will continue, God willing, in September. Till then, carry on being ready for the return of the Lord, and tell as many people about Jesus as you possibly can. God bless you.